Boom. This is something that it could spiral off on a whole other tangent and could probably be another hour-long conversation. So I would suggest that we probably save this one as a later conversation, unless
we're just going to go right back into it. So I'm gonna if you don't edit, then the listeners are coming on. Wait, what's Eugene talking about?
Right.
And we were just talking about a project that you're working on, and we got talking about systems. We started talking about Norman Borlaug, and we said, well, the point of what the recording here was to talk about my views on sustainability, on the environment,
right,
and what we human beings can do about it, and what people are missing. That I believe that when you get it, well, we talked about it before.
Mm-hmm.
What was it, about a week ago, 2 weeks ago? And,
yep, about a week ago.
And both of us felt, oh, we should have recorded this. But so but this is stuff that it's going into my book. Hopefully it'll be turned into a TV series or movie.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to practice doing it. You want to hear it again, because I think it takes a couple listens for it to sink in.
Yep.
And then you have to physically work on it yourself and like put it into practice.
Mm-hmm.
So how should we start? We could review, like, why did we start in media res, or whatever that phrase is, which means like we start in the middle of conversation.
Right.
We could go back on that, but they don't know what they're missing. I think we should just jump into the starting before. But what do you think of where to start?
Yeah, I mean, well, there were so many things, because we did talk about this last week at good length. I think we had a good, like, maybe 2.5 hour long conversation on this. And you talked about so many different interconnected things, from the future of energy to population growth to people's desire for growth and continuous growth, and about how so many people now are looking at things like renewable energy as a solution. If we can just get more solar panels and more wind energy, we're going to just be able to solve all of our energy problems, and then we'll be good. But you talked about how those things are more, I think, about increasing efficiency, if that's correct.
Yeah. What was your takeaway? What did you get out of it, and what do you want to get out of this one?
The main takeaway that I got from the entire conversation was that, I mean, the biggest point, there were so many good points in there, but the biggest takeaway that I got is that we can't expect to grow forever. We just can't expect for everything to just constantly get better. We're trying to find all of these solutions to problems that we have, and a lot of them turn out not to be solutions to the problem, but just kind of band-aids, things that...
Now, I'm sure you'd heard that before, but it sounds like it took on a different meaning for you after that conversation.
It definitely...
Everyone has heard we can't grow forever.
Sure.
So why, you had heard it before that last conversation. I probably didn't say those words, like, we can't grow forever.
Mm-hmm.
So why did it take on a different meaning, if I'm reading you right?
Well, to me, so for me, the biggest thing that has stuck with me is the stuff about efficiency. For me, as somebody who thinks a lot about, as an engineer and somebody who thinks about, renewable energy and using renewable energy as a way to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, and that, in my mind, it was kind of, if we can just get, more solar panels and more wind in there, we'll be able to reduce everybody's impact on the world. Mm-hmm. And that would put us as a society in a better position in terms of how we treat the environment. But you brought up so many different examples about how, going from 2 lanes to 3 lanes, you'd think, oh, we're going to solve traffic. But what tends to happen is that when we have 3 lanes, people just end up making use of more lanes, and we end up growing to meet that added capacity, or the, making up for that efficiency that we found by just using more. LEDs do better than regular light bulbs, but we just end up using more LEDs. We end up just putting LEDs in everything we have.
And how did it make you feel? Were you confused? Were you enthusiastic? Were you bewildered? Were you amazed?
The most immediate emotion that obviously it was a lot of stuff. It was a long conversation, and the immediate feeling was slight despair, because it felt a little bit like there's no way out of this then. I don't think, like, for us to reach a point of balance with the planet basically just requires, everybody changing the way they live, which, if we look at history up till now, people are not all of that willing to do readily, or just reducing the population down to 3 billion people. And both of those options, to me, just, they almost sound like a fantasy or a dream. I just don't see those things happening without us actually being pulled to that point by nature. If eventually we do get to the point where entire food systems are collapsing and people are having to get into wars, to have to fight over what resources remain.
Sorry to interrupt, but
yeah,
I'm really more interested in your feelings. Okay, so you were going to get into a lot of detail that but if we're having this conversation, you're not giving up. You're not filled. What happened after the despair?
Okay. So I spent a lot of time thinking about it after. And to me, one of the things that I kind of thought about is that, yes, we are going to have to change the way we live on a very large scale at some point. But at the same time, those changes in efficiency do help us somewhat. If we can change the way that we live, if we can maintain this way of living and make the efficiency better, maybe there's some hope for us there. And I found one spark of hope there that made me feel a little bit better. I could be completely wrong in my thinking about that, but I don't know. Am I wrong there?
When you say spark of hope, what was the spark of hope? Is it? Oh, you're saying that there's hopeful. That you after the despair came some hope that we could turn the ship around.
Yes, that at least the efficiency changes if by replacing coal and fossil fuels with wind and solar, and by doing those things we can increase our efficiency. It will at least maybe buy us some time for people like you and me that are now growing in number, people who are actually very actively trying to get people to change the way they live their lives and to recognize their connections to nature. And maybe we can get people to change a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. I'm glad to hear that. That's how I feel. I think that there's some chance of it. It's not a high chance, and it would have been a high chance 50 years ago, even 20 years ago. I mean, we're already feeling the effects, right? There's a global pandemic. That is an environmental effect of efficiency of factory farming. They made more money, the factory farms. Well, this particular one happens to be from encroaching into wildlife territory, also expansion. So we're definitely feeling the effects. Everyone under lockdown, if they prefer not to be under lockdown, you're already feeling the effects of a system that's got problems.
Yes, to say the least.
And I've heard a lot of people talking about how to fix the disease, how to cure, how to get vaccines and so forth, but not how to stop producing virus mutations and pathogen. It doesn't have to be viruses, it could be other things. We're producing these mutations and getting them to jump from species to us with factory farming, with going to wildlife territory, and with wet markets and things like that. And there's very brief limiting the wet markets in China, and I think that they're back. There's been no decrease in the density that we pack the animals in, and no call for like, okay, we'll accept that chicken will be a little bit more expensive and we're not going to breed avian flus in the process. So we're not changing the system. And more to the point, we're seeing major global problems. No one questions global warming anymore. No one questions whether humans are doing it. I mean, maybe a few oil company shills are deliberately choosing to say there's doubt but no one believes that. I mean, I don't think, we all know it's happening, and we all know it's on us. There've been enough 500-year storms back to back, enough beach erosion that global warming, the sea level rise is no question about it.
Right.
We've all seen pictures of beaches covered in plastic. Hopefully we've read about things like mercury poisoning and PFOAs and PFOSs. We probably know about PCBs and dioxins. And these things aren't decreasing. A lot of these things just simply don't break down.
Right.
Or not on a human timescale.
Right.
So it's already on us. Something like 9 million people died in 2019 from air pollution, just breathing the air, nothing else, just breathing the air. If we don't change, so I have a view of, why don't I get into should I start at the beginning?
Yeah, I would say let's do that, just because I think for all the people that didn't get to hear the conversation from the start last time, let's take it back a step and let's go to the beginning.
Okay. And well, I do want to comment on one thing. There's a couple of perspectives that I found very useful. Business people and military people, there's an analogy that I like: strategy and tactics. If you make something more efficient, that's a tactic. There's a strategy that that has to be within. If you simply keep making a system more and more efficient, you'll get the outputs of that system more efficiently. You might make one little part of it more, maybe you'll produce a little less waste in one little part of it. But if the whole system is still haven't changed, if you make a system that pollutes more efficient, you'll pollute more efficiently. More waste with less effort. That's our world today. We are more sedentary than ever. I scroll through a few finger taps, and somewhere someone drives a 2-ton vehicle, with a little bit of pressure of the foot on the pedal and a bit of pressure on here, drives this 2-ton vehicle to bring stuff wrapped in plastic that's going to be around for thousands or hundreds of years at least. Mm-hmm. The exhaust coming out the back of the vehicle, or at the plant, if it happens to be an electric vehicle. Right now it's still coming off of fossil fuels.
Sure.
The amount of pollution for me to get it used to be someone just walk out and like maybe dig something up out of the ground and eat it. And so the amount of pollution that we're getting per amount of effort is higher than ever, through exactly the process and perspective that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And if we simply make it more efficient, that's a tactic. If we don't change the system, a strategy, mm-hmm. then you can do all the tactics you want. If you don't have a strategy, you're generally going to go around in circles.
Sure.
You're not going to get a strategic goal done through tactics alone. You have to have a strategy. I mean, this might be a mission level or something like that, but mm-hmm. There's levels of working. And if you work at a too low level, you don't get the results you're looking for.
Right.
It's Band-Aids. I mean, if a Band-Aid is fine if you have a little cut, but if you have cancer, it's not going to work. And there's a problem with our system. It's not just like there's a little bug in it. So, all right, I would like to say that, I would like to say that I didn't know anything about all this stuff. And then when I read this one book, I watched this one video, and I realized, I was so polluting, and now I can change. And now I know what to do. And if you just read this one book, watch this one video, or even a series of them, then it'll all make sense. I wish I could say that. I wish I could say, I just learned this stuff and then figured it out. And now I'll give to you what I learned. Mm-hmm. And that would be it. I'd like to say that I was just, a wasteful, ignorant person, but I was far worse. I did not start this off ignorant and wasteful. On the contrary, I have 5 Ivy League degrees, including a PhD in physics and an MBA. So physics meant I knew the science. No one knows all the details about climate and all the different environmental things, but I can understand it pretty well. And I helped build a satellite. That's a pretty big tech thing. So I knew how to build things. I knew how wavelengths and circuitry and I know I can figure out solar. And I knew business. I'd built a fortune, lost a fortune, ups and downs, built many projects, got lots of funding. I mean, all the media for success. I mean, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, ABC, NBC, all these, everything, CNN. And so therefore I could look out at the world and said, I know exactly what to do. I know how fusion works, roughly speaking. I know what it offers. I know what fission, what improvements can be made over like 3 Mile Island. It doesn't have to be like that. I knew how to get efficiencies in the system. And I knew how to build companies to implement these things. And I could even imagine building not just companies, but industries to solve all these problems. Mm-hmm. I knew about votes and how to change political leadership and things like that. So in short, I knew exactly what to do. And I was also very confident and I was knowledgeable. I knew people. So in short, I was the height of the problem. I knew exactly what to do what I knew was what had been happening for the past at least 200 years. And I was what I call now stepping on the gas, thinking it's the brake and wanting congratulations for it as I accelerate faster toward the cliff. So I had to unlearn all of that stuff that the system had taught me that was very successful to maintain how things were going. Mm-hmm. And I had to learn to step out and look at things in a different way. And that takes, the reason we're talking this time is because last time you heard it, you're like, there's something there, but it takes a while to digest. And until hearing it is one thing, you have to do it and live it to some degree and realize that when you make the shift, when you're in one culture, oftentimes, if you don't realize that there are other cultures out there, you think the way you live is reality. You might think growth, if we don't grow the economy, people won't have jobs. If people don't have jobs, infrastructure will fall apart, hospitals won't be staffed, people will die in childbirth, 30 will be old age. We're going to return to the Stone Age. Sure. So we have to keep growing. If you learn that there are other cultures that aren't growing, I don't just mean like Japan, but cultures that have lived for hundreds of years, actually thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of years without growth, then you realize, oh, maybe growth isn't so necessary. Maybe there are other ways of looking at things. So people who have moved to another country have witnessed this to some degree. In America, we do it X this way. And then you go to another place and they don't do it that way. And you think, sure, how can they possibly do that? And you think that must be terrible. Then you get into that mode and you're like, oh, I see, it works differently here. This can work too. And then you realize it's not reality, it's just that culture. But without actually living it, you often don't get it. So I'll share a lot about perspectives and views that I've had. And if someone doesn't actually live it, it'll be nice stories. But if they start practicing, it really changes. And that's how we've gotten to know each other is right. Deciding to put stuff out into the world. You through your videos and videos and blog, mm-hmm. and now the podcast that we're doing together, mm-hmm. and me similarly. And I've walked you through taking on personal commitments to act on these things. How did that go?
So far, they're going well. So far, the changes that I've made, you're talking about the ones for my own life, taking on changes.
Picking up garbage. Life. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. They all make life more fulfilling. I totally have come around to understanding what you talk about when you talked about, what most people see as being a sacrifice. Oh, Eugene, if you're going to turn off the hot water while you're taking a shower, you're going to be missing out on hot water time in the shower. If you're picking up garbage, that's time you could be doing something else. But doesn't end up feeling like a sacrifice once you actually start doing it, and it's something that is a value, something that is valuable to you. Then it makes your life feel better for having done it. Everything feels more valuable that way. I feel more connected. When I pick up trash at the park that I go to now, I now go to that park and feel like pride. It feels like, oh, this is my park. That hill right there used to be covered in trash, but now I did that. I made that clean. This is my park. And I feel like protective of it. I feel like a steward of that park. Like I call that park my park. Like when I'm referring to it in my blog or in my Instagram posts, I just say it's my park because it's where I pick up trash. And it's also where I decided, where I was actually listening to your podcast at the time and decided, you know what, I'm going to start this whole verdant growth blog and YouTube channel to try to see if I can convince more people. So
this is heartwarming to hear, but I'm going to put the heartwarming part aside, even though I feel really happy to hear the effect I've had. Now, and I want to point out, you talked about values and you talked about emotions. And most people don't think about values and emotions as like a way to solve our environmental issues. And they probably also heard cold shower. I don't want to do that. And they probably also thought, if everyone in the world stopped taking hot showers and never took cold showers, even if they liked it, that's not going to make a difference in the world. So, but what they might not have picked up was that that joy and that feeling is leading you to more and more and more. So in my third TEDx talk, I make a big point. Big or small is not the main measure for the first thing you do. If that's a measure, then everything will be too small. It's, if you like it, then you'll keep doing it. And if you do it more, it's inevitable that it'll get bigger and you'll share it. You are deliberately choosing to lead others to find this joy. So I'm not going to tell people to stop saying little things add up. I'm sure they do, but that's not my strategy. My strategy is meaning, because meaning will lead to big and shared. Big and shared, that adds up. So that's what actually now I'm going to say what we were talking about before we did this was, if you want to change, if you want an oil tanker to turn, you could put a whole lot of energy into people putting in front, like paddling, and that's not going to turn the oil tanker. You got a rudder in the back, you turn it, and that rudder, it might take a day or several hours, but even though that's tiny little rudder, that will actually steer the ship.
Sure.
Now, systems thinkers, people who work with systems, know about something called a trim tab, which I just told you about, which was like, we were like, we should have recorded that. Well, now we're recording it. On the back of the rudder is another rudder. So if you want the ship to turn this way, you make the rudder turn that way, and that'll turn it. On the back of the rudder is another little rudder called the trim tab, and you make that one turn this way. That will turn the big rudder that way, and then the ship will turn. And to turn the trim tab is very little effort. Systems thinkers, people who work with systems, love to think of themselves like, I'm a trim tab, or like find what's a leverage point in the system. If you change that, it may take time, but there's very little effort. I mean, the amount of effort you'd have to, people with oars in the front of the boat to turn the ship is like, it's not going to happen. You could have like 100 people all paddling as fast as they possibly can. One person does that little moving the trim tab, very little effort, and that actually steers the ship. And so changing people's emotions, their goals, their expectations from what I do doesn't matter to, I like this. If I do this, I want more I can do. And if you get people to a place where they feel like, not only is this like my life, but it's just making my life better, I want to share it with others. It's going to make their lives better too. And if that catches on, that's a trim tab in action. And
the dream is to become
now
a trim
someone
tab.
looks at, and find out where are the leverage points and how can you affect them very well. So to produce another power plant is not a trim tab. To get people to where they start thinking, do I need as much power? Do I need power on all the time, no matter what? Just simply asking that is more of a trim tab thing.
Mhm.
Now, we're not there yet. I'm not proposing that people think that way because it has to come from somewhere. So here's a couple things. I'm going to tell you about, I've told you about the spider mites and the elk and the yeast, right?
Yes. But
Okay,
I
I'm going to
would,
start with that.
I would love to hear those conversations again too.
So last summer, a year and a half ago, the summer of 2019, I was growing cherry tomatoes on my windowsill over there. One day, I noticed some of the leaves are shriveling up. And I don't think much of it. Maybe I'm overwatering it, maybe I'm underwatering it. A little while later, a few more of the leaves have shriveled up, and there's like a kind of white residue or something on them.
Hmm.
I don't think much of it, but I mentioned it to a friend, and she goes, "Oh, you might have spider mites." I don't know what spider mites are. And I look it up. So they say they're these little bugs that they're too small to see on the plant. They grow on the underside of leaves.
Mm-hmm.
But you tap on the leaf with a piece of paper, and if you see something crawling on there, that's a spider mite.
Okay.
So I had spider mites. And I mentioned it to my friend, and she's like, "So what do you do about it?" I'm not going to get some big pesticide, some powerful chemical. I'm not going to do that in my apartment. And she says, put it in the shower and like wash them off. And I'm like, how do you get the thing upside down? It doesn't, it's a lot of plant. Meanwhile, more leaves are shriveling up. And one day I go over and like all the leaves have shriveled up and they basically all fall off. And I thought, the plant had died. It didn't quite die. Out of habit, I kept watering it. So even after all the leaves fell off, there were like a few leaves left. So the spider mites killed their source of food. Because as far as I can tell, the spider mites know if you can eat, eat. If you can reproduce, reproduce. End of story. If they could get together and say, hey, we got a good thing going here. This guy's watering this plant for us. Why don't we keep our numbers to a certain level and we can live in harmony with the plant, with our source of energy and life. Mm-hmm. But they can't do that. All they know is if you can eat, eat, if you can reproduce, reproduce, and boom, they destroy the whole thing. They're living on a sad, shriveled remnant, and a tiny fraction of the population that could have been there had they figured it out.
Right.
And it's hard to not ask, can we humans do better than spider mites? Can we do better than bugs? Because we're looking like we're growing pretty fast.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people say, Pachash, the population's leveling off. Right? We've all seen the projections. It's supposed to level off. Actually, some projections still show growth at 2100, just not quite as fast as it's been. So this brings me to my friend Kevin. And this is a conversation on my podcast. If you look it up, you can hear the actual conversation. I think it was recorded. He lives out west and he got a ranch house in Idaho. He goes out to Idaho and that's where he's seen elk for the first time. So elk are like big antlered deer. Roughly speaking, I don't really know. I've never seen one. Or maybe I have. I don't know. Anyway, he's got a neighbor out there who's a hunter. And he's sitting with the hunter, I guess, on their porch. Off in the distance are a bunch of elk. And the hunter says to Kevin, about how many elk do you see over there? And Kevin says, about 100, I guess. And the hunter says, yeah, I'd say about that. He says, in this area, he's lived there his whole life. He goes, there's enough food over the winter to feed about 75 elk. And Kevin says, I guess that means 25 of them are going to die over the winter. The hunter says, no, 25 are going to live. So I pause now and it takes a second to think of it, but then you realize the elk don't measure the food and measure their population and say, there's 25% too little food. Hey, 25, you 25, take one for the team and don't eat and just die.
Right.
They don't do that. They all keep eating. And the next day, there's enough food for 74 over the winter. And a little while later, there's enough for 73 over the winter, and then 70, and then 60, and then 50, and then 40. When spring comes by, the 25 who made it are shriveled up. Right. They barely make it. Now, it could be that the hunter wants to, he's got a self-interest. I'm not killing 25, I'm saving 50 if he hunts. Well, we took away the apex predators. We had the wolves and the cats that used to eat them. So it's just us. So the hunter wants to point out, he has a motivation to point out his value of killing them. Maybe, but I think the effect is genuine. I mean, we have taken away the predators. They're growing without bound. And so not that here's the thing. I'm thinking, I work with people, not elk. I don't really know elk very well. So I think I said to Kevin, next time you see the hunter, can you ask him, what does he think will happen if there's 25% too low resources for humans? What will happen? Because there's many differences between elk and human. A big one is that elk don't have lines on maps that say, if you cross this line, I will defend my territory. And when humans start defending their territories, they say, I don't care about the future. It's here now. This is my family. I got to protect them. And we go to war. We got machine guns, we got nuclear weapons, and we got border skirmishes already that this stuff gets threatened.
Yeah.
So I could see it not, if there's not just 25% too few resources, I could see 10% too few resources could lead to 10% of the population left. This is just, I'm just throwing out numbers. I'm not trying to back this stuff up right now. But I could see that effect being stronger. But another big difference is between elk and human is that they, as far as I can tell, they don't have science. They don't have compassion and teamwork and empathy like we do. I could see us forestalling these things. We don't have a few months. Well, it's already hit us, as we talked about, but for that kind of level die-off, if we're over the limit, if we're over the capacity, and fossil fuels, living unsustainably, and chopping down forests, and taking out more fish than it can replenish, turning renewable resources into non-renewable resources, that allows us to be above what the earth can sustain.
Sure.
It doesn't change that eventually that stuff will run out or will hit other limits. If that happens, then we could go to far below what the capacity would have been had we not overused it. So you might ask, a lot of people still think, well, maybe we can just level down to below. I forget if I asked you, have you brewed beer or wine?
Never personally, no. No, my dad has, but not me.
You might know that beer, I mean, to make these things, it's fermenting. It's a yeast that grows on the sugars inside grains for beer and inside fruit for wine. We ferment the stuff. We brew and distill this, not distill, we brew and make wine for ferment for the alcohol. We want the alcohol, but the alcohol is the yeast waste.
Right. Because
it's living in its own waste, you can only get it to a certain amount before the yeast won't produce any more alcohol, because you can't get an organism to live in its own waste above a certain ratio.
Right.
You might know that the higher alcohol beers, which is like, I don't know, 10, 12%, you can do other processes like distill it and use ice and stuff like to get higher, but just through the yeasts, you can't get past a certain level. If you want to get the highest ones, you might know that the high alcohol beers tend to be sweeter. The higher alcohol wines are the sweet wines. Because if you want something living in its own waste, you have to give it lots of energy. You have to give it lots of food. So you put more sugar in to get more alcohol, but after a certain point, you put in more sugar, it doesn't get any more alcohol. We are living in our waste. And fossil fuels, our source of energy, enables us to live in more waste. So we're like the yeast, we are like the spider mites in that we're growing really fast and not paying attention to the bigger picture. And a lot of people say, well, it's leveling off, but the population isn't leveling off because people have calculated what's the carrying capacity of the planet. We're way above it. They're doing it because their local situation is something that like it benefits them not to, but there are plenty of places where it benefits people to have more kids. So the net population growth in the world is still very high.
Sure.
And many places, actually the United States, for example, a lot of people know that we're below replacement levels in births, but through an immigration and a belief that we must grow, we simply outsourced the growing. I mean, we used to have a lot more pollution in this country. And one of the reasons for it decreasing is we used to have factories here that we've moved overseas. I think people get that if you move the factory overseas, you haven't reduced the pollution, you've just moved it somewhere else. If that place has lower regulations, you have actually maybe globally increased the pollution. It's just far away.
Right.
If you outsource the manufacturing, you haven't lowered pollution, you've just moved it. If you outsource the baby making, you haven't lowered it, you've just moved it somewhere else. With this weird effect that I hope people don't act on this, but you can sense when you really talk to people about it. then you want the other place to be worse off than here, because if it's better off than here, then they're not going to come here.
Right.
So we want people, we have an incentive that I hope people don't act on, that we want other places to have a high birth rate and to be unhappy so that so that we get the best of them.
Mm.
It looks like that's happening.
Mm.
So to say that birth rates are low in some places doesn't change that we have a system that drives growth, population growing. And if we're over the capacity, then it's simply a matter of time before we drop down, like the elk.
Right.
So we're like the spider mites, we're like the elk, and we're also living in our own waste. Our standard of living, I think you probably have read that now for the first time, people are going to live shorter than before. Something like 9 or 10 million people died from breathing air, just breathing last year or 2019. PFOAs, the chemicals and stuff in the environment that aren't going to, we all have, I was reading about on these forever chemicals that were used to make Teflon and certain things.
Uh-huh.
They were in every blood sample that they tested, not just humans, everything. The only place they didn't find it was in veterans' blood from the Korean War from the 50s. Mm-hmm. And these guys have probably died by now. And not from this, but just their blood sample is that old.
Right.
And this stuff causes cancer and all sorts of, it's everywhere. And to this, I'm going to add one more thing that I have no counterpart in nature to illustrate with, is that these chemicals that, up until recently, you might know that before the automobile, horse manure was covering the streets of every city in the country.
Yeah.
Like knee deep in it. It smells bad, and it probably breeds cholera. That's a big problem. One of the things that cars did was, now the horse manure problem went away. Well, even when there was horse manure, at least you could take it out in the country and use it as fertilizer, and some animal somewhere would use it as food, would metabolize it. High concentrations of mercury, PFOAs, PCBs, dioxins, radioactive waste. There's nothing that metabolizes those things. And they're poisonous to us and lots of other things. I mean, things will metabolize them, but not on a human timescale. It takes a long time. Mm-hmm. And we can dream that maybe there's some mushrooms that are living in Chernobyl. Maybe that'll solve a lot of problems. These are pipe dreams. I mean, not on the timescale that humans need it to happen. So on top of, we're growing fast, we're over the limit, we're living in our own waste, and our waste is toxic. And we not only have to not keep making this toxic stuff, we have to figure out a way of getting it out. There's been no counterpart for this ever. Mm. I mean, for that last fourth part, but this is our situation as I see it, is we're spider mites, we're elk, we're yeast living in our own waste, and we got toxic waste. Now, do we have hope? I mentioned
the big question.
Yeah. So there's a couple of populations I want to point out that I'll start with this amazing book that I read, Affluence Without Abundance, about the San Bushmen in Southern Africa, a guy who lived with them. Wonderful book. I'm reading the book, and it's talking about how they live hunting and gathering. We don't know if it's like how people lived before agriculture, because there's no one around that no one took records of it.
Sure.
But they do have an archaeological record of how long people lived there. And I might have guessed 10,000 years, 20,000 years, 50,000 years. I mean, 50,000 years ago is something like when humans migrated out of Africa to start populating the rest of the world. They didn't start in Southern Africa. Humans, I believe it was Northern Africa, Ethiopia, somewhere around there. Mm-hmm. People have been living in those areas, roughly speaking, in what we can tell as they do now, for 200,000 years. So roughly speaking, the Industrial Revolution, roughly 200 years ago, 250. Yeah. So they lived stably. Were they happy? We don't know. Was it brutal and nasty and short? We don't know. But they lived there, continuously. Think of the floods that they had and the weather patterns and all the sorts of things that they lived through over 200,000 years. Something like 1,000 times longer than it took us to go from a population of well below a billion to where people legitimately say the environmental situation is an existential risk, meaning humans might die off. And even if you don't think the species is going to, I don't think the species is going to go away, but we could be down to like subsistence living and subsistence living as we did before, but not, the sea levels are going to keep rising for a while now. And they're going to hit the landfills, and the landfills are going to disperse throughout all the oceans. And then we're just going to have people living off the land in a very polluted world where there's going to be birth defects and everyone's, your IQ and my IQ are lower because of leaded gasoline. It's going to be like on a bigger scale. And if as the population drops, there's a lot of fighting, there's going to be could go nuclear.
Sure.
But certainly they're going to be living in a polluted world. And they're also not going to have easy access to fossil fuels that our ancestors did to kickstart an industrial revolution that we hope will convert from relying on fossil fuels to relying on renewables. But you can't just make wind farms out of nothing. I mean, you can make windmills like the ones that have been around for hundreds of years, but not to power a civilization like ours.
Sure.
We could convert to that, but if we lose it, I don't see us getting back to it. And I do see people living like mutations all over the place because of our pollution the legacy that we leave for them, if that happens. Meanwhile, these guys live for 200,000 years, no growth, stable. And by the measures that I see of the people living roughly like that way today, they're happier, they work fewer hours, they have more sense of community. By the measures of meaning and purpose and value, they seem to do quite well. Meanwhile, even before the pandemic, I understand that I think the number one source of death, or the number one fast growth one, was opiates and addictions. And even if you don't count opiates as a big one, if you combine opiates with what these other addictions of sugar, alcohol, and the sugar stuff, salt, sugar, fat is now you're getting into diabetes and heart disease and things like that. So we're not living so happily today. I mean, I'm pretty happy, but I don't think I think we're not as happy as we could be. We're not living as meaningful and purposeful lives. Anyway, so going back to them, they were able to pull it off for a long time. Now, they did not have agriculture. I don't see us going back from agriculture. So I got to talk about Hawaii.
Okay.
The Polynesians discovered Hawaii. No one knows exactly when, something like 1,000 years ago, on that order. For some time, this I got from this other book by J.B. McKinnon called Once and Future World. And the goal of this book was to discover what was nature like before humans got there. Turns out it's not so stable. And it's a very different picture than we thought. So I highly recommend this book. Oh yeah. Ships logs from the sailing age of ships going across the ocean, nowhere from land to be seen. The ships came to a halt in the middle of the ocean because the density of the fish in the water was so high that the ships didn't move. They're whaling ships that, people go to Maine so they can look out, and maybe if they're lucky, they'll see a whale. A whale was just seen in New York Harbor maybe last month or 2 months ago. And everyone's like, wow, that's amazing. Ships logs show the ships, it was whales as far as the eye could see all day long. You might know that wherever humans went, they knocked out the big animals, the large animals, wherever they went, Australia and North America. North America had more large animals when humans arrived than Africa does now, or ever did.
Really?
Yeah. And mastodons, and they're like beavers the size of Volkswagens, apparently. That's what I learned from this book. And that was our world. It's hard now if I walk in the woods to realize that the woods that I walk through now near my mom's house, which is 100 miles northwest of New York City, they used to be teeming with life, not just trees. It's very different than what we thought. There were, what are some other examples? There was walruses in the Thames River by London. There were I had to look up this fish, this river in Germany, where it was just talking about how there were fish that were the size of humans caught regularly.
That's
That
incredible.
they talked about when the fish went up the Hudson River here by the Hudson, it would cause waves of the fish, so many of them.
Huh.
I mean, we are nothing, like if we return to what it was like when you and I were children, it's nothing like it was before. I mean,
Yeah.
this very much reset my understanding of nature.
Huh.
So I recommend the book. And if you look up my my series of videos called Your Daily Environment on YouTube, I only did a few of them, but the number 9 and number 10 episodes were on that book. So I read a few passages.
I'll give it a look.
So from that book, I learned that the Polynesians discovered Hawaii. Itself an amazing feat. I mean, something like 1,000 miles at sea. How did they know? But they get there. And for some time, there was trade between Polynesia and the people who colonized Hawaii.
Uh-huh.
And at some time, the archaeological record shows, no one knows why, but the trade stopped. The Hawaiians were on Hawaii all by themselves. And they lived there for something like 500 years until Captain Cook arrived. And in that time, they lived, the archaeological record shows, according to the book, that, while they were trading with Polynesia, the ability for the Hawaiian Islands to sustain life and society decreased in that time.
Huh.
Then when the trade stopped, it increased again. Why did that happen? How did that happen? We don't know exactly the mechanism because we don't know the details. My takeaway is that when they realized this is what we got, when there's an escape valve, we can get more resources if we need them, or we can leave here if we have to, then, well, let's use this. Why not? And then when they realized this is it, this is us. And they must have quickly realized that if they keep growing the population, they're going to be out of balance. And they probably realized if you have a baby, you have to wait until someone dies because we can't. So they must have had a way of regulating their population. We don't know how, but they must have, because 500 years is ample time for the population to grow like, well, we've populated the world in less time, overpopulated the world in less time than that.
Could it have been disease or something of that nature, some kind of natural something?
That would naturally keep them at just below, at a rate where they were in balance. So for a disease to keep them in balance, how would that disease kill certain but not all? It seems like it must have been a conscious decision, a deliberate choice. Mm-hmm. Also, when Captain Cook arrived there were very harsh penalties for doing things like fishing out of season, or bathing in the freshwater pond. So it seems like they had very strong regulations on, very loose regulations on if you murder someone out of rage. Mm-hmm. They're lax on that. But if you bathed in the water, that was serious. If you killed this type of bird, that's pain of death. So it looks to me like they figured out, whether trial and error or for whatever means, how to stay below what the land could sustain. I want to point out, the Hawaiian Islands are, I believe, volcanic islands. Uh-huh. Let's say that off in the distance, a new volcano went off and created a new island. Then when that island came up, it would be at first too hot. There'd be no life on it. And let's say they knew that they could paddle over there, or however they get there, and bring some plants, and they could terraform this land. Now let's call this island, let's say they call it Mars. Just because you can colonize Mars and grow new life there doesn't mean that the ones on the old ones now can live out of balance. If they're going to colonize there and new ones are going to be born there, you can't take the ones from here and put them there. Or if you put them there, then now you've colonized that. You have to live in balance everywhere. So that was a suggestive name. Just because you have a place where you can grow new doesn't mean that the old can live out of balance.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe the one guy who's like, I would like to go to Mars, he can think I can escape this mess. So that you get a couple generations of people doing okay over there, but it doesn't fix the people back on the old islands. Mm-hmm.
I wonder who that one guy is, by the way.
So we have done it in the past. Humans have lived in harmony with nature. And Hawaii is one example of many. There are many islands where that happened. There are many areas in the Amazon, places where people were stuck on their own and they realized this is what we got. It's just us. It's always been a moderately sized population. Never 6 billion, 7 billion people.
Sure.
So now let's come back to even bigger picture. I don't know what it was like. No one alive today knows what it was like before agriculture. There are two giant revolutions that changed humanity that I think without peer. The Industrial Revolution and the Agricultural Revolution. I think both caused inflection points in the population birth rates and changed how we live in ways that I don't think, like the American Revolution didn't, that was a change, but not on that scale. It didn't change humanity. It just changed how some lived. Actually, it's related to the Industrial Revolution, as I'll get to in a second. So I don't know what it was like before. And probably it was just our wiring was built to live with a couple dozen people in this area, and there's a couple dozen people over in that area. And as I said, when we study people living as close to that as we can see today, they seem to be happier, well-adjusted, pretty smart. They know like all the life around them, and they're living pretty well. Actually, what's destroying those populations in the southern Africa, some would say it's joblessness, but they didn't need jobs. They would just go out and, if they're hungry, they go catch an animal, or they dig up a root, or they pick a berry. And I'm not saying this is like some noble savage thing. This is just not good or bad. It's just when we measure their happiness levels, they're pretty high. When we measure the amount of work that they put in, how many hours per day, it's less than us. When their stress is lower. And probably we evolved to have emotions that guided behavior that worked there. So then we discovered that we can tame animals and plants, and in the Fertile Crescent, and then later in other places, we had civilization pop up. The way we just lived naturally had to adjust to the new style of life of living in one place. And there were early attempts, like the Code of Hammurabi, I don't know how to say it. It was one early, and you look at the pyramids, there's lots of ways that people had of like making society work. Now, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth was pretty brutal. So that's not the one that stood the test of time. It seems that there's a period of time of when the dust settled of how to live in an agrarian society where we have private property, where we divide up land and we can inherit it, and we have tools and things like that. So eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth left everyone blind. It was a little bit brutal. And some people adjusted it. So Buddha threw in a bit of compassion. Jesus threw in a bit of mercy. Confucius, a bit of filial piety. Lao Tzu, Aristotle. These are some of the names whose ways of living have stood millennia. Muhammad. And that, I'm not saying it made people happier, it may have, but it led to growth, so that there are hundreds of millions to billions of people following in their footsteps. So these were methods that enabled societies to grow. And they are still around today. They worked, whereas Hammurabi didn't. The Industrial Revolution led to another big change. The combination of fossil fuels, of discovering how to use them, and then the metals, and the Industrial Revolution caused another big growth. People started working on scales and collaborating on scales that we hadn't before. It became non-local. Then the names Adam Smith, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton. These led to cooperation on corporate and national scales. So nations formed before that, but certainly then. That's what shuffled out. That's what like settled as how we adjusted to this revolution, the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't planned out. This is as it happened. The world that I grew up in Philadelphia and now live in New York City. I grew up in a world in which the predominant mode of living, philosophies, outlook on life was Jesus, Adam Smith, Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson. That's the world I lived in.
Mm-hmm.
Had I grown up in China, maybe a bit less Jesus, a bit more Confucius.
Sure.
Maybe a bit of Marx thrown in with the Adam Smith. But these are the names that have resonated throughout. These are the ways of living that have resonated throughout because of these revolutions.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see us going back on agriculture. I don't see us going back on industrialization. But those philosophies have not figured out how to work on a global scale. What the Hawaiians figured out on their global scale was, how do we live in balance? There's an opportunity here from a leadership perspective. I teach leadership. I don't know if you can see it, but my book's on leadership. Here's a CD version, Leadership Step by Step.
Hey.
Best-selling. And from a leadership perspective, either we don't pull out of this and we're going to have, it looks to me like the elk situation. We're going to drop down to well below what the earth could sustain if we did what the spider mites and elk can't do. Mm-hmm. We can, but have not done. So we could drop down to 25%, but I think it would be a greater drop than the elk have. In which case, no more civilization. I'm sure people will be living in New Zealand and by the poles, eking out a living, eking out. But if we make it, for centuries to millennia, the people who figure out how to do on a global scale what the Hawaiians figured out, and maybe the Southern Bushmen, the San Bushmen figured out, whoever figures that out, these are the names that will resonate throughout history as Jesus, Adam Smith, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton level names. We have not figured this out yet. What will make it work? I'm not exactly sure. That's what I'm trying to do. We have no role models for this problem, except that we have solved problems like at this scale before, of like, how do we set up a civilization that works? Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, they figured out something that works. Any questions? I could jump into some new stuff.
Yeah. No. Well, yes. I have a few that have come up that maybe are not directly related to what you were talking about just now, but ones you were talking about before. Just curious. Do you feel like, with the population size that we have right now, is it even possible? Can we stabilize with this population? Do you feel like, how much change would be required from everybody? Like, these days we have a growing number of people who enjoy trying to live off the grid, people who are enjoying, living in mini homes and trying to live completely off the grid and trying to sustain themselves. Like, do we all need to go to that level, in your opinion? What do you think?
So I'll tell something about my life that gives me a lot of hope. There's a lot of directions I could go here. I guess I'll start off with my personal experience. I thought that if living with less, we all had to live with less. And I thought that would suck, but we have to do it. But if we made things a lot more efficient, then we could figure these things out. Should I go with I'm going to go in the Norman Borlaug. No, I'll talk about my life. So about 7 years ago, I thought, I'm thinking, only governments and corporations can create the change on the scale that we need to change. What one person does doesn't matter. Nonetheless, I looked at my own garbage and I looked at it and thought, this garbage is my responsibility. Maybe it won't change the whole world, but I don't want this to be some person 500 years from now having to deal with this. So even if I can't change the whole world, at least I can take responsibility for my messing up someone else's world. Mm-hmm. I asked myself, well, the way it shook out was, could I go for a week without buying any packaged food? And when I first did it, I thought, well, that's going to suck. I live in New York City. Within a 2-minute walk. I got cuisines from a dozen cultures. I must be living in one of the great food locations of the world for all time.
Absolutely.
And it's going to cost more. I'm going to have less variety. It's going to be less convenient. It's going to take more time. And I thought, still 1 week, give it a shot.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, that began for 6 months. I thought about it. I was like, what will I eat day 1? What will I eat day 2? What will I eat day 3? How will I do this? And after 6 months of this, I said, what am I doing? I'm not going to die. I'm starting right now. I don't know the answers. I'm just going to start right now. And, if I just eat apples for a week, I'm not going to die. And I know that I can. So I go to the store. I mean, I allowed myself to finish what was in my cupboard. So I'd eat, I had bread that was packaged, but I wasn't buying anything new. But I had to shake out the rules to live by for that week after I did it. Because why did I analyze and plan? Because school taught me to analyze and plan. And I did what school taught me. And I was very good at what school taught me. I had an MBA and a PhD by that point. Ivy League. So, but that didn't solve the problem. Actually facing the problem did. Go into the store and I, habitually go to the aisle where I'd get whatever I'd get and be like, oh, can't get that. That box, bag, rubber band, sticker, jar, whatever, not getting those. So what I got? Just produce. And so I had to go and figure out what I do with, and there's bulk foods there. So I could bring a bag and fill up my own bag. I didn't count old stuff as new packaging.
Sure.
So I could get legumes and nuts and seeds and flowers and things like that. So I did something I'd never done before, which was to soak some beans overnight and boil them on the stove. I never did that before. I was kind of proud to do it, kind of neat. And for 1 week, I can deal with the problems. There's lots of middle steps, but cooking on the stove it turns out my rice cooker would cook legumes too. That didn't make it any shorter, but it made it, just press the button. I don't have to watch it. Some of them would bubble over, but that, in terms of my prep time, it was much less.
Mm-hmm.
Then that led to a pressure cooker, which when I first got a pressure cooker, I'd never grown up using one. I didn't know. I was like, is this thing going to explode? I don't really know. And I got, as always, used off of Craigslist when I want to experiment with something.
Uh-huh.
So I got it for half price off of Craigslist. And now it turns out beans cook in like 4 minutes. Lentils, 4 minutes cooking time. That's almost as fast as from the can.
Yeah, that's pretty fast.
And the long and short of it is that I've ended up making these famous no package vegetable stews. It's like my big go-to thing. And since I'm always buying now from, so after I made it 2.5 weeks without buying anything packaged, I had some friends over. This is 6 years ago now. I was making something and I needed some tomatoes. So I said to someone, hey, can you run downstairs to the bodega downstairs and get a can of tomatoes? They came back up and I opened the can. I'm like, these aren't fresh. Why did I pay someone to melt aluminum so I could have not even the tomatoes I want? That was the last time I used a can opener. And I went from throwing out my garbage once a week to once every 2 weeks, to once every month, to once every 6 months, to once every year, to once every year and a half. So it's now January 2021. I did not take my garbage down to empty it down the chute once in 2020. I'm shooting to make it until 2022. I want to go 2 calendar years without emptying it. My net food joy has skyrocketed. It's more convenient. It's much more social. I've met the farmers where I get most of my stuff from. I have relationships with the people at the farmers market, because I get so many free vegetables from them because we know each other. Mm-hmm. And a lot of other people, like they'll buy beets and they'll say, I don't want the leaves. So they chop off the leaves, put them in a box to take back to the farm. And I get them for free because I know that the leaves are super nutritious and delicious and you can't beat free. And they're smiling as they give me the stuff. They're like, sorry, we don't have more for you. I'm like, I don't mind that you only have this much free stuff from you today. A lot of people say, well, you can do that because you got a farmer's market right there. They don't know my childhood. So if they did, they know how important accessibility is to me. Mm-hmm. I've gotten the welfare food and it's, I don't want to do anything that others can't also do. So if you don't have a bulk store near you, and today you won't get down to zero packaging as I've been able to or that low, it's not zero. But if you order, I've gotten 50-pound bags of legumes and they don't go bad. So And it's like $2 a pound. Actually, when you get it that bulk, it's even less. And so you can get nearly to my level of waste and probably even saving more money than me. And the last talk that I gave before the pandemic, people are like, I heard this so many times. You don't know what it's like, Josh, to be a single mom in a food desert with 3 kids and 3 jobs, and you don't have time for all that sort of stuff. And if they just get McDonald's, then you can't fault them for that. Well, McDonald's is doing no one any favors. I think they have the cause and effect backward. It's not that because they have less time, McDonald's helps them. It's because of McDonald's, they have less time. From a systems perspective, I'm not going into all the details, but the cause and effect is probably that veneer of convenience is causing the cycle of being stuck. And Martin Luther King, when he did the Poor People's Campaign, he talked about how much more expensive it is to live in a slum than out of a slum. Mm-hmm. They're really good at keeping people stuck in there. Yeah. So when people say, "Oh, if we want to get organic food into food deserts, we should get like Walmart. They do all this organic food now. We should get them." Walmart knows how to extract value out of a community better than anyone. We want farmers markets up there. So one day I'm at this lunch, actually at the farm, and the woman sitting next to me is a single mom from the Bronx. So I'm like, oh, all these people tell me single mom food desert can't work. And so I invite her over for my famous no packaging vegan stew. And I recorded the conversation. We did podcast episodes. Uh-huh. She's like, oh, I can do this. This is great. She invited me up. The last talk that I gave before the pandemic was I brought my pressure cooker and the ingredients up to the Bronx and did a cooking demonstration. There's a little bit of the video. They didn't record the whole thing, but just a little bit of the video of me up there. And it's a community center church. After I show them what I do, the first person says, we can't do that up here. The next person says, actually, I know where we can do this part. And the next person, I know how we can do that part. And then eventually, the woman who invited me up there, Rhonda, when all is said and done, she says, Josh, you planted the seed that we can see how to do this. Because I've been up to farmers markets in the Bronx and I've seen people walk right past beautiful vegetables that at reasonable costs. Mm-hmm. And they go in to get the fast doof, the McDonald's and the Starbucks, that it's impoverishing them. But if they don't know how to use the stuff, then you can give them all the vegetables they want. They won't. I'm going to digress again to talk about Harlem Grown. Sure. Do I want to talk about? Yeah, I'm going to talk about this. Remember where I am now.
Rhonda about food deserts.
Yeah. So in 2008, I go up to this place called Harlem Grown. It's a small little oasis. Uh-huh. It's an urban garden. Uh-huh. And I met the guy who founded it. So in 2008, this guy, Tony Hillary, his business wasn't doing well because it was a recession. For some reason, he went to this one particular school and volunteered his time just to help kids. And the kids were like, oh, Uncle Tony, Uncle Tony. Everyone loved Uncle Tony. Across the street from the school was an empty lot that probably once had a building. So it's the size of a Manhattan building, row home, brownstone, I guess. But it's empty. It's got tires and maybe like a hulked out car, maybe a refrigerator or something. So the city he petitions the city allows him to do something with it. He doesn't know what. He gets the kids to help him take out all the garbage, chop down the weeds, and he builds flower beds, but plant beds, wood things with dirt to plant. Mm-hmm. And he envisions having an urban garden there. So after the first stuff is set up, and the kids all help, and he says to the kids, okay, here's some seed for chard. We're gonna dig a hole, plant the seed, water it, we're gonna get chard. So the kids dig a hole, they plant the seed, they water it, and the kids go, where's the chard? And he says, well, it has to grow. They have no idea. They don't know what chard is. They don't know it has to grow. So they water it, and like a month later or so, the chard comes out. Uh-huh. And to this day, this thing is growing like crazy. And really, he doesn't charge for any of this stuff. He gives out to the neighborhood. And if you walk maybe a mile in any direction, you will not find fresh vegetables grown or sold. You'll find plenty of Dunkin' Donuts. You'll find all this, not what I would not call food. And he gives it away for free. Actually, down the block, by the time I was there, they had gotten a second lot, which they had this whole hydroponics thing going. Wow. No space age stuff. It was like hand put together, but growing plants like crazy. Sure. Anyway, so So we're going to get a little noise. Sorry, from where I live. I live across the street from a firehouse, and so they're about to test their Jaws of Life machine, which they have to test every day. So the chard grows. He gives the kids the chard to take home and eat.
Yeah.
So the next day, the kids are there, and he says, "How was the chard?" And they say, "Our moms threw it out."
What?
So the parents didn't know either. At least one generation was lost.
Right.
Maybe the grandparents knew, but maybe the grandparents didn't know either. But one generation wouldn't know what to do with vegetables when they're handed to them for free. So to push a solution on them, I don't think is just to throw Walmart in there. Walmart's going to extract value as well. That's what they're good at.
Sure.
I went up there to teach them how to cook this stuff. This Green Bronx machine, a teacher in the Bronx who's teaching kids how to grow plants, and that's growing like crazy. People love the stuff when they get it. But we've lived in a culture for some time. It's been about growth and disposability and things like that. Anyway, so back to where I was before I digressed about that. I learned to cook, and I love my food now. I've actually found more variety. It saves money. Now that I know, making food at home doesn't take longer. Not knowing how to cook takes longer. Not knowing how to cook is expensive. Once you know those things, it's pretty quick and more convenient, more variety and so forth. Since I'm getting local stuff, I'm often getting stuff that I haven't seen for 10 months. All these people are getting like strawberries 12 months out of the year in plastic containers. I get strawberries 1 month out of the year, but my net enjoyment of strawberries is much higher. In the way that when I was in college, I would drink to get drunk. Now I have scotch every now and then, a bit of wine now and then, much less alcohol, much more joy of alcohol. And it's much more about community and where did this come from and who made it and how did they make it this way and why and so forth. And much less spent on alcohol as well. So there's the material change. And so now it takes me something like 2 years to fill up a load of garbage. That's the material change. There's a psychic mental change, which was, why did I think it was going to be worse? Why did I think this was going to be deprivation, sacrifice, and a burden? I felt like I was taking one for the team. Is there something that I was missing? And I kind of wondered now I would say I found that by living by my environmental values, even though it looks like I feel like I'm going to be swimming upstream, and maybe I am swimming upstream, but actually internally, the joy, the community, the connection are much greater. Now that's how I say it now. It's still falling into place. Somewhere along there, I was watching a video of this guy who wrote this another amazing book. You as an engineer, if you haven't read Sustainability Without the Hot Air by, I think his name is David McKay. He's since passed away, but he was Caltech trained physicist. He was at either Oxford or Cambridge, I think Cambridge. He wrote a book. He was answering the question, could England live sustainably with its current population? He wasn't thinking politically, could we do it? Just if we used all sustainable stuff. And he looked at it one way: if you include nuclear, if you don't include nuclear, if you include, solar farms in the Sahara with giant undersea cables. What he found out, and this is as of, 10 years ago, forget if it's politically feasible or you could do it monetarily, financially. If you took, at that time, if every place you could put a windmill, you put a windmill. If every place you put a solar, you put solar. If every place you could put a wave farm, and they worked, and every river that you could dam, you dammed, you could just barely make it, barely. Now, the population has grown since then. Their standard of living, they keep increasing more. So it's probably not the case anymore. Anyway, very interesting book. And he endeavors to make it understandable. He wants it to be a book that anyone can understand. So he makes the units very easy to understand. He's not like an Olympic-sized swimming pool full of this, or he makes it, read the book. Anyway, so I see a video of him, and he says that flying New York, LA, round trip, warms the globe about a year's worth of driving.
Okay.
Now, it depends, first class is going to be more. It depends if you're driving, how much you drive. So it's roughly speaking, round numbers. I think it's within a factor of 2 or 5. Now, I live in Manhattan. I don't have a car. I'm thinking I must be polluting a lot less than the average American. But I'm flying around a fair amount. In the world, something like 90% of people have never flown, ever. So everyone who's flown is like the height of privilege. Now, within that, the people who've flown across an ocean is like a couple percent, maybe 5%.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've flown across an ocean, you're super, like, if you think I can't live, I have to fly in order to live,
Mm-hmm.
you are so far removed from humanity. And I was on a flight actually when I saw this video. So I'm thinking, I'm way over the IPCC limit of what, the Paris Agreement limit of per capita,
Mm-hmm.
what people can live sustainably.
Right.
And I thought, but flying, I need to fly for family. I need to fly to make a living. I need to fly if I want adventure, to get different cultures. Life
Mm-hmm.
without flying, is that worth living? Totally disconnected from almost everyone who's ever lived and almost everyone who's alive today.
Right.
The privilege, right? The height of like, oh, I must live. And so, and then I also thought of, when I went without packaged food for a week,
Uh-huh.
I thought it was going to, it's the same sort of dread of how can I, this modern world, this is what we want.
Mm-hmm.
Why would I step away from that? And I thought, but that actually turned out way better than I expected. I wonder if that could happen here. So I thought, I wonder if I could go without flying for a week. But a week is like, of course, a month. So I thought a year. Can I go for a year without flying? And immediately I'm like, what am I going to lose my, I plans to do stuff. And so I did what I was really good at, which was to say, let me think about that. I'll analyze and plan.
Sure.
So it was in the back of my mind, shoved back for a while, until my next flight was out to London. And then I took the train down to Paris, and I was like lying awake in bed, like, this is a lot of pollution. And I thought, let's go for it. Let's go for a year without flying. Let's see what happens. And again, if you try to plan it out, if I tried to plan it out, it wouldn't work. But actually doing it, right off the bat, I had some speaking gigs that were about to close in Europe, and I had to, it was a university, I think, in Italy. And I wrote them and said, could we arrange to go by boat? Never heard back from them again.
Yeah.
And this one in Poland didn't happen. And then meanwhile, my sister, who lives in Brooklyn, she was like, Josh, she spent 4 years in Japan. So she brings her family there periodically because she's got lots of her host family there. And she goes, Josh, why don't you join us our next trip there? I found round trip tickets to Tokyo for $800. I'm like, $800? That sounds like below cost. Like, I'm not going to see that again. And Susie's, she's fluent. She'll be a perfect guide, and we'll get to stay with families and eat local food and stuff like that. I'm thinking, let's go for it. And then I was like, oh, wait a minute. I thought I'll start when I get back. I'll just one more trip, and then I'll start when I get back. And I said, am I trying to live by my values or not? So I declined that. And for a couple months, I was miserable because I felt like, how am I going to get these things? But then I thought, do I want to stay miserable? No. Can I get adventure otherwise? Can I get cuisine otherwise? And I started rebuilding and getting more of what I thought I could only get from flying. Mm-hmm. So I spend now more time with family. Now there's family far away that I can't, all right, I'm about to start my 6th year of not flying. I never said I'm going to go for more than a year until I found that it improved my life, just like eating unpackaged food. So I thought, I'm in my 6th year. It turns out that I'm getting more of the, I'm spending more time with family. Oh yeah. This is what I was going to say. Avoiding flying is like avoiding Facebook. While you're using it, you're like, but all my friends. And so people who quit Facebook, they realize, yes, there's roughly, if you had, 5,000 Facebook friends, roughly 4,900 of them, you're going to lose most contact with, but the remaining 100, you're going to be in greater contact with, and your net relationships don't go down. Mm-hmm. The meaning and purpose and closeness and intimacy, that goes up. And that's been the case for me. So there are some family members that I've not seen. My nephews who are in New Zealand right now, I would love to see them. And I believe that they will understand that it is my love for them that I'm expressing in not flying there. Mm-hmm. That, because I believe that this will help change the future. And that really cemented that experience of having, here's another thing that this woman, Frances Hesselbein, is a big mentor for me. And I shouldn't do this on a recording, but she was born during the First World War. Uh-huh. I just went to her birthday party in November online, she turned 105. Don't tell her
I was gonna.
I said that, because she's of a generation that's like, you don't talk about a woman's age.
Sure.
So I thought, someone who lived through the Depression and Prohibition and through World War II, that's as much a different culture as anyone in the world. And that was a subway right away. So I would spend time with her that I wouldn't have otherwise. That led to, she was the chair of, she was an appointed chair of a 2-year position at West Point. Service is a big thing for her.
Huh.
And she put me in touch with General Lloyd Austin, who has Biden just named him, that he's going to nominate him to be the Secretary of Defense.
Wow, really?
So I met him when he was just a retired 4-star general. And he brought me up to West Point to co-teach some leadership workshops there. West Point I just took the bus up there. That's as different a culture, and it's right there. And for any American, anyone visiting near New York City, you've got to visit West Point. It's a phenomenal, I don't know what it's like COVID now, but it's the cadets there. I talked about service, and this people today are like, you want me not to fly for a year? The cadets, they know the last several elections have been pretty close to 50-50. So they know that they're putting their lives at risk. They're considering the ultimate sacrifice, knowing that roughly half the country vehemently disagrees with them. Mm-hmm. And so I would ask, like, how do you feel about that? And they're like, I believe in the Constitution, and I'm acting in service of others. Mm-hmm. And this has dramatically changed. The feeling of service and community is so much, seeing the Eiffel Tower and Machu Picchu just does not compare with that. But it doesn't have to, because the beauty of the world around, not flying, you realize, people think to see nature, you got to go up the Amazon all the way up to the top and go to the most remote places and go to 7 continents and things like that. Mm-hmm. Nature's everywhere. The more that we think that it's out there, but not here, the less experience of it we have, mm-hmm. not the more. I go and pick berries in Manhattan that I would never have known, and herbs. The lavender around here is amazing. It just grows almost like a weed. And I know where to get it. I'm not telling you where, but if you come and visit, anyone who watches this, if you come and visit, I'll go out and pick stuff with you.
Awesome. I'm going to take you up on that someday.
Virtually every market in Manhattan, 12 months out of the year, you can buy mango. People think of mangoes as exotic, but in actual practice, anyone can get one anytime they want. As we head into the winter, I'm going to have radishes, turnips, parsnips, rutabagas, beets, potatoes, sweet potatoes. I get the root vegetables. The last of the green stuff is, we got like another month or 2 of like cabbages. Mm-hmm. In actual practice, turnips are much more exotic, even if they go around here. So people go around the world to get something that is local there, and they don't eat what's local here. So my actual experience of, like, Thai food is my favorite food in the world. Uh-huh. If I eat Thai food here, it's nothing like Thailand. I mean, for one thing, you can't get the galangal and the lemongrass picked that morning. For another thing, they cover it with salt, sugar, fat here. Uh-huh. And I tell them, like, please don't put so much of that fruit stuff, the fruit juice and the coconut milk. And they know what keeps people coming back, which is salt, sugar, fat.
Sure.
So I don't like to eat it here. Now I have learned to sail, and I started learning to sail before Greta sailed across. So I do expect to sail across the Pacific and get some Thai food. And my experience of that Thai food will be, my net Thai food joy in life will be greater, and my net travel experience will be greater for sailing across the Pacific. But my eating what's here puts me more in contact with people there, more connection, because I'm living how we live here, how we would live here, and they're living how they live there. If I'm just going there and like seeing it like I'm going to the zoo and being like, oh, look at this cultural object and things like that. And like, oh, I've had Thai food. And when they say, do you want Western spicy or Thai spicy? If I say Thai spicy, it's like inedible. Like, I'm sure you've had like how spicy it is. And So I'm getting, and people go to the Amazon and there's like this lovely little cafe on the bank of the Amazon. That's not what the Amazon is like. I don't care how lovely that cafe is. And now you've gotten that culture to want your tourist dollars. And meanwhile, we don't go to not my last vacation, but I rode my bike. I was going to ride my bike up to my mom's house, which is, it's 100 miles by car, but 120 miles by bike, because I can't take the highways.
Mm-hmm.
And also I wanted to go up there's a marked route that goes up by the Hudson River, and it's really beautiful. So it's 120 miles, significantly hillier than I expected. And it turns out that the last time I rode 120 miles was in the 80s, and I was like 20 years old, and I'm pushing 50. So I got really tired, and I realized I couldn't make it the whole way. So I made it 50 miles and decided I'm going to just head back.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll do a 100-mile day. That was Bear Mountain State Park. So it's a beautiful park. I'm going along the river, and it actually is really near West Point. So a little while later, when I was talking to one of the colonels at West Point,
mm-hmm.
I mentioned this, and I said, I bet if I'd called you, I was thinking there's a train station near there. I could have if I called him up and said, want to have lunch? He would have said yes, even if he was really busy, because service, they such great guys. And then I could have had lunch with him, taken the train back. Uh-huh. And I didn't do it because I knew it would oblige him too much. But he said, next time you want to do it, come up and ride your bike, we'll have lunch, and we'll plan ahead. And so now it's like more connection. And I mean, maybe I'm going a bit over the top with talking about the lifestyle changes, but I want to illustrate
mm-hmm.
that I was at the height of the mainstream American culture. Mm-hmm. I was earning my living through flying and living the way that most people think of like American way of life. And I thought if I simply made it more efficient, that would solve the problems. And I also thought that if I didn't live that way, it would be a huge sacrifice and a burden. It would be a chore. It would be deprivation. My actual experience has been the opposite. It's been to realize that the way I was living was extractive and disconnecting me from people. If I fly to someplace and I'm going to pollute their world, and I know that I don't really want to get to know them that well. If everyone in your community, at least once a year, feels that they have to get at least 1,000 miles away, and most of them multiple times per year, what happens to a community? Let's just look at levels of pollution, levels of litter. If you have a lot of litter in your neighborhood, and you're going to get away from it all mm-hmm. periodically, I think you tolerate a bit more. What problems get left unsolved? As it happens, if you go to Bali, you're going to get more pollution there because everyone there is thinking the same thing. So everyone's devaluing where they live. And we're living shorter lives, less healthy. Most of the top causes of death are diseases of the success, the material success that we've had. Mm-hmm. And now I've seen that there's other ways. So the trim tabs in the situation that I see are, what are the leverage points of a system? A system is perfectly designed to get the outputs that it gets. Mm-hmm. Our system produces a lot of waste. Our issue now, like the yeast, we're living in our own waste. We're also over the limit, like the elk and the spider mites. I don't think carbon dioxide is not the cause of global warming. Carbon dioxide has no mind of its own. It has no volition. It purely reacts to us. Our behavior is causing carbon dioxide levels to rise. Our behavior is causing dioxin to come into existence and PCBs and things like that. Our behavior is how we distribute goods and services so that some have and some don't. If we want to change, if I could snap my fingers and return all pollution levels to pre-industrial, but we didn't change our goals and our values, and therefore not our behaviors remain the same, we would be right back where we are now in a short period of time, certainly within our lifetimes, probably within a decade, because that's what we would do. Mm-hmm. I mean, I could go into more details, but if we believe that we have to keep growing and we have to keep making things more efficient, we'll keep growing and keep making things more efficient. If we want to change our behavior, we have to change what caused our behavior. It's our beliefs, the images, the stories we tell ourselves. Now, if we change those, it won't immediately change everything in the world. If we don't change them, we can change everything else, but we'll be back where we started. If we do change those, we got a chance. This is what I believe we have to work on. There are lots of our system, the global economic system that we live under has many goals and values. Most of them aren't relevant to the environment. So they're fine, but there's some that are relevant to the environment. Chief among them, the four big ones are that and if you're in the system and you don't know about systems, if you're in a culture and you don't know about other cultures, you think that the way you do things is the only way. That's reality.
Sure.
If you think growth, if you think if we're not growing, then we're not going to have jobs. And if we don't have jobs, the GDP, if the GDP isn't growing, then we don't have jobs. If we don't have jobs, infrastructure falls apart. Hospitals don't have staffs. People die in childbirth. We're going to return to the Stone Age. Mm-hmm. Then you don't realize that in Hawaii, they lived quite well for some time. And Southern Africa, they lived 1,000 times longer. So it's possible. And not just, there's just two examples of many. So we believe that growth, material growth, GDP growth, which requires population growth. We believe in efficiency. Our problem is not that we're not efficient. We're more efficient than ever. Mm-hmm. We're producing total waste. And if we make the system more efficient, we'll get more waste faster.
Sure.
Comfort and convenience. Makes a lot of sense. I worked hard. I want to come home and watch TV, take a break. I don't want to work so hard. I don't want to cook all the time. Can't I get takeout? And what's the fourth one? Comfort and convenience. Externalizing costs. Well, I mean, we kind of get not to just dump mercury anymore, but companies will still do it. But basically, if you have two companies and one of them has just two cafes, one gives you mugs mm-hmm. that they have to wash and the other one has disposable. Mm-hmm. In our world today, we can externalize those costs.
Sure. And
the one with the mugs, they got to pay someone to wash the mugs. They got to have a dishwashing machine. They got to pay for the machine and its upkeep, extra real estate for that. So they have extra costs. It's going to cost more. The disposable one, if we don't properly account and we don't, someone's got to, if we just say once it's thrown away, that's end of problem. Mm-hmm. Then that company's going to have higher margins and more profits. They're going to expand and they're going to push out of business the other one. And that's happened in many industries that externalizing costs has been more profitable. So those four values are the driving our system, among others, but these are the ones that are relevant. What I've found is four complements to those that I believe that if they switch these values on the individual level, we'll live happier lives. And on the social, cultural, human level, we will change to a different system. Mm-hmm. And this is what's driving me. The complement to growth would be, to material growth would be enjoying what you have. Also personal growth, developing as people, but not needing more stuff. Now, from the perspective of growth, you feel like, what do you return to the Stone Age? But when you're in the other culture, the old system looks from when you enjoy what you have. Mm-hmm. I'm sure people have found minimalist blogs and things like that. Growth looks like craving, always wanting what you don't have, never satisfied, always wanting more, more, more. It's really, from the new perspective, the old one looks like craving. It looks like it leads to addiction. Always wanting, and then you're under someone else's control. Someone else can, if they have access to what you need and want, then you have to pay them. Mm-hmm. When I hear the word bucket list, I hear craving. And anyway, that's another topic. So efficiency, the complement to efficiency is resilience. They're not complete opposites, but if to be resilient, you often have redundancy. If you're running business people know this, if you run a factory at 100% efficiency, mm-hmm. then everything's just in time. There's no extra inventory. Then sure. If a machine goes down, the whole factory has to stop because
Mm-hmm.
everything depends on everything perfectly. People who run factories know, have a bit of inventory. If this machine goes down, run off the inventory that's in stock, and hopefully you make it until the next downtime, which is also not efficient. And now fix that machine and replenish the stock overnight. And now you haven't taken the whole thing down.
Mm-hmm.
So our culture is more efficient than ever, producing more waste than ever. It's also more fragile than ever. It's brittle. Why does it happen that like fluctuations in some price over in Southeast Asia means that farmers in the Midwest can't pay for their stuff? Because it's so efficient that everything's locked together that small perturbations anywhere affect everywhere.
I see.
Efficiency would be, resilience would be, this post of mine that you retweeted about how I unplugged my refrigerator.
Uh-huh.
Because it's not because I'm trying to save that little bit of energy. It's not zero, but divided by 7.8 billion, it's a rounding error.
Mm-hmm.
But I read this article about how if you make it, just looking at our power grid, if you make our power grid less efficient, but more resilient, to go from 99% uptime to 99.9% uptime
Mm-hmm.
is really expensive. Because you have to build all these extra plants to handle that capacity. Like,
Mm-hmm.
Even though it might be just at the height of the summer when you have multiple 100-degree days, say around here,
Mm-hmm.
you got to have capacity for that peak. That means you have to have capacity 365 days a year, even if it's not running all the time. So a lot of people are like, Josh, if you want to do everything off renewables, the wind doesn't blow all the time. The sun isn't shining all the time.
Right.
And so we need giant batteries. And in any case, you need fossil fuels and nuclear to fill in those gaps. And if you go to higher and higher uptimes, it gets more and more expensive, and you get almost no savings. If you really want to keep those uptimes high, even if you switch to almost all solar and wind, you still need you can't just turn on these things. You got to keep them running, idling all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So you almost get no benefit. But it goes the other way too. If you go from 99% uptime to 98% uptime,
Mm-hmm.
the cost savings and the pollution savings drop precipitously, or the savings go up, so the need goes down.
Mm-hmm.
If we could live in a world in which if I suddenly had a blackout, it doesn't really bother me. Right now, the only things plugged in my apartment are my computer and my phone, and I don't really need them. If we had planned blackouts, planned days, on the 5th of the month, we're going to do maintenance. Like subways around the world, New York is 24 hours, and it's really expensive.
Mm-hmm.
But most subways go down for a few hours at night.
Sure.
And the costs and a lot of things benefit in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Now here in New York, we're like, but we have to have 24-hour. But people in other places aren't like dying from not being able to catch a subway at 2 a.m.
Mm-hmm.
And there's lots of ways that we can make our system much more resilient. We'd lose efficiency, but we would be happier. We would need less stuff. We'd be less needy.
Mm-hmm.
So from a resilient world, the more and more efficient you get, the more brittle you get, the more prone you get to catastrophic failure. Resilient means you don't have it. Also, have you ever thought of what it means to be at the carrying capacity of the planet in terms of population?
No.
It's the most number of people the planet could sustain.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, if everyone's living with abundance, with material abundance, you can fit more people.
Sure.
So you have to keep on putting more and more people. The carrying capacity is when everyone's living there's no more resources left. Everyone is here's how my friend put it. It's like everyone's like on the verge of suicide.
Right.
Because they have nothing to spare. And if you put in one more person, someone else has to die. We don't want to live anywhere near the carrying capacity.
Right.
We want to be well below it. I don't eat meat, but I don't like factory farming under any conditions. But if we lived in a world where people could eat meat the way that our ancestors did, but if someone wants to eat steak, crickets are not a substitute. Crickets are what you do when you're trying to make things as absolutely as efficient as possible. Mm. Okay, you want efficiency? Give up steak, eat crickets. I prefer to live in a world where people can eat steak, cruelty-free. Someone would say that's absolutely impossible. Well, I've been vegan for a long time. I'm not going to get into all that, but I certainly have no problem with Hassan Bushman eating meat the way that they eat meat for hundreds of thousands of years.
Sure.
So that's resilience. Comfort and convenience. If people people say, I deserve a break. I don't want to work so hard all the time. Josh, you have to cook all the time. First of all, cooking is a joy. I mean, it's a great experience. My interaction with nature through my food is much higher than if I flew down to the Amazon and paddled around there for a little while, knowing I'm polluting it on the way there and the way back, and changing it and opening the door for others to go and change it yet more. I mean, name a place that hasn't become a tourist trap just because it isn't yet, like it's on its way. Right. Try to find a vacation where you can get away from it all, from where you can get away from not filled with people. There's a great site on the internet. It's like what the guidebooks say, the pictures in the guidebooks, and actually what it looks like. So there's like a picture like Machu Picchu, and it's beautiful. And then they show a picture from an actual tourist. It's like people everywhere and lines and,
it's the fantasy.
The flip side to comfort and convenience is meaning and purpose and service, stewardship. I talked about how my acting in stewardship connects me more with people far away, more than actually going there in some superficial way, of connecting with people here, connecting me to people everywhere in a way that close, personal, intimate friendships and relationships is more meaningful than more and more Facebook friends. Mm-hmm. From the perspective of comfort and convenience, it looks like all those things take extra work. But from the perspective of finding meaning and value and purpose and stewardship, acting in service of others, it's so much more, it gives you energy. Mm-hmm. The way I often put that is when I was going out clubbing and all my friends, we were friends with the DJs and there's celebrities around and we'd party. And if someone said, would you rather party like you're partying now, or would you rather get poop out of your hands? I guarantee all of them would say, are you nuts? Like, I don't know what you're talking about. That's crazy. But then one by one, they all had kids and they'd change diapers and they'd get poop on their hands. And not one of them would trade their kids for going out partying again. Uh-huh. Now, the stages of life that you go through, but once you shift to acting in service of others, as the cadets at West Point do, the meaning of life is so much greater. There's so much more. So externalizing costs is the fourth one. Uh-huh. In our world, if you don't externalize costs and someone else does, we're at a competitive disadvantage. If we don't, someone else will, right? If we don't drill this oil, then the Russians and Chinese will. Mm-hmm. And then we'll still get the same pollution, it's just we're gonna lose out. So we might as well do it. That's really where stewardship comes in, is taking responsibility for how your behavior affects others. From that perspective, externalizing costs looks like cruelty. It looks like benefiting yourself at someone else's expense. Mm. You know that the pollution is going to get someone. Just because it doesn't get you directly right here, right now, doesn't mean it's not getting someone. Mm-hmm. How human is that? And historically, there are two huge cases. I'll go with the smaller one, but then the bigger one. When New York was going to ban smoking in bars and restaurants, a lot of people said, if we don't do it, people are going to take the PATH train. There happens to be a station right here. The train that goes to Hoboken, they're going to go to bars there, and we're going to lose business here. Mm-hmm. 2 years later, Hoboken had to ban smoking in bars and restaurants because people were going from Hoboken to Manhattan because they didn't want smoking. When you live in when bars meant smoke filled, you think, of course, otherwise there can be no bars. But more importantly, the competition will get it. Uh-huh. And the bigger case was in the late 18th century, early 19th century in England, when they were talking about abolishing the slave trade. People said, well, if we don't trade the slaves, then France will, Spain will, Portugal will, Holland will, Sweden will. And then in 1807, they passed a law saying the slave trade was illegal. Now that happened, they had the credibility and motivation to influence the others, and all those nations I just named, plus the United States, outlawed the slave trade. It was the opposite of both cases, the opposite of what people expected. So this is externalizing costs, thinking the competition will beat us, that if we don't, someone else will. History doesn't bear it out. So my goal is to bring to the world what I have experienced and what I've witnessed many others experiencing. There's nothing special about me in this area. Certainly not that I have special access to these things. In fact, my background, for once you get it, my background held me back from getting it in ways that just because I was so sure that I knew the answer was, I knew fusion would solve everything. If, too cheap to meter, no radioactivity coming back out, plenty of supply. We'll probably have to save it for another time. Maybe we can pick up with fusion.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what I want to pick up on is fusion and other solutions, other would-be solutions that seem so clear to me that now looking back, it's why they're stepping on the gas, thinking it's the brake, wanting congratulations. And I'll mention that there are a few role models. People who have historically, starting with one person or a small number of people, have changed precisely the type of things that we need to change on the time scale that we need to change it. So Edwards Deming is a big one. William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, and the abolitionists of that period in England that I talked about, as well as people who followed them in the United States, like William Lloyd Garrison, and Machai Viravaidya, who, a lot of people talk about how nations go through this demographic shift. When economic conditions and education levels reach a certain point, then they start producing less people. The population stops growing so much. They talk about that like it's something that just happens. In some cases, it's just happened. Although, to think that the level that they don't level off at a level based on global carrying capacity. They do it based on local conditions, which is decoupled. If you're lucky, it's connected with the rest of the world. But we know that our global footprint is much higher it's higher than one planet. So even if we level off where we are now, we're still like the elk. So Machai Viravaidya is one example. He's the first example that I came across where I'm not going to go into the details. I'll save him for another time because I think it's close to midnight for you.
Yep.
I mean, is it past midnight?
It is.
Oh, sorry.
12:20. No, that's okay. That's okay.
So he think the opposite of the one-child policy. Think the opposite of anything you've heard about eugenics and like racist, sexist, fascist stuff. Think the opposite of that and think of it working more successfully. And then think of that happening in many, many other places. But we've never heard of it because we're blind to seeing it because we just think growth.
Right.
So the more I learn about people who created these shifts on the timescales that we need to act according to the predictions, that create people love they love the transition. They never want to go back, and they can't believe they didn't do it earlier. And that's what's available to us, and that's the kind of trim tab stuff that I want to bring out. And until I experienced personally the feelings of the joy, the community, the connection, the more delicious, the saving money, the more the helping people in food deserts, not talking about them, but getting them to where they're inviting me back. We want more of this. Once that happened, then I could act to share with the world what I call leadership. Leading not by telling people what to do and seeking compliance as a manager would do, but seeking inspiration, not through facts and figures, which are important, but also with stories and images and role models, working on the system, not just within the system. I could go on.
Yeah, no, but that's actually that's probably a good place to stop right there. And once again, it's just like, it gives me so much stuff to think about there. I'm sure that we could probably have another 2-hour long discussion just about, those 4 values that are driving our system that you had talked about, and how we could go about changing them and how we could work on individual ones. But there's just so much interesting stuff there
and I'd say for what's in my book, some of the stuff I talked about was in the book, some of it's not, most of it's in the book. I'd say I'm about a third of the way through. So there's the role models. And then there's the whole part of what do I actually do myself? Why do I expect that if I act, it'll make any difference? And if I do make a difference, what difference do I make? How do I actually do it specifically? So that's like I'll probably end with that part. Because I believe that this gives meaning and purpose to act, an expectation of success. And knowing that there are others who did it is, to me, a major component. Because if I didn't know that people had done it before, I would give up. But the changes that I seek to do, that I believe, people will be happy if this sweeps the world. I think everyone who does it will be like, oh man, I wish we'd done this earlier.
Yeah.
So yeah, I can't really run through my head. Like, there's no checklist in here. It's just, it all fits over the course of the better part of a decade. It's fit together, plus a lifetime of understanding experimentation, things like that before. It generally fits together into what I believe would be the new culture, a way of living and working with each other that, I'm not saying it's like peace on earth. I'm not saying it's no strife. I'm not saying there's no disagreement. But it would be more like Hawaii. And Hawaii, I mean, now Hawaii's significantly paved over. So more like Hawaii before.
Yeah. Sustainable, not just in the way of we have lots of solar panels and wind turbines all over the place.
Oh yeah. I don't know if you put in a list of like the role models, but also I haven't talked about Norman Borlaug, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for the Green Revolution. And yeah, it's not just living sustainably. I think a lot of people think sustainable living means crickets and no steak and deprivation and sacrifice.
Yeah.
It's living sustainably and joyfully, living more happily, more connected with your community, more time with your family, less stress of what's to come and things like that.
Right.
So now it's not peace on earth. It still will take work, but democracy takes work too.
Right.
And this would be democracy. So yeah, there's a lot left of what's to come.
Yes.
And how joyful it can be.
And I want to be sure that that's something that we actually get to also on the next time that we talk. I would love to hear more about what you think about how we can shift more of that perception away from those values that you talked about. And
well, let's schedule that. I mean, I guess we'll stop recording and then schedule that, and then we'll pick up.
Absolutely. Let's pick that up for another time. Just before we stop the recording though, if there's anybody who wants to find you or find you online, where can they find out more information about you or hear more of what you have to say?
Well, for me in general, there's joshuaspodek.com. For a lot of this stuff comes up in my podcast. So joshuaspodek.com/podcast, or just click podcast in the upper right corner. For the leadership stuff, I mean, my books, a lot of this perspective doesn't look like it's about the environment specifically applied there, but to lead others and to lead yourself. My book, Leadership Step by Step, is how to change yourself and lead others so that they want you to lead them again. And my book, Initiative, is how to, most people think of it as starting a company, entrepreneurship. That's a subset of what it does, because a lot of people associate that with like Silicon Valley. Initiative is about how to create in your life, to take initiative so that you create self-perpetuating projects, which could be for profit. One of the students of mine, he got funded by Zuckerberg and Eric Schmidt from Google, and got into Y Combinator, and he's onto his next thing after that one already, and lots of stuff. But a lot of people started nonprofits. Some people just started local community projects, and some people have just used to change their lives, to have significantly more passion in their lives and have peer relationships with people that they used to think were unattainable. So they get to meet these people and not just know them, but be viewed as a peer by leaders in a field of your interest, and to have support. They have a vested interest in your success. It's life-changing stuff. And they can look at your blog to see your reviews of it. I think that's public. Yeah,
that's one that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about recently, my initiative project. And it's a learning experience in so many different ways. And I'm not done with it. I'm looking forward to being able to say that I went through all 10 steps and that I finished them all, and be able to talk about the experiences I had, because I'm still working through that process myself. I'm still trying to figure out how to get myself into that right mindset so that I'm thinking about problems and solutions in the right way, and you know, setting my own goals and achieving them. I'm excited for that. And Leadership Step by Step, that's literally the next book on my reading list. I'm super excited to read that one as well. So
yeah, there's reading and there's doing the exercises. So the doing the exercises where it really comes in. Yeah, I think that people right now are trying to put more science out in the world.
mm-hmm.
That's very important. I will never say we shouldn't learn more science about what's going on,
Mm-hmm.
but giving people facts and figures does not, very rarely changes behavior, especially when their habits are otherwise, and especially when the culture goes the other way.
Mm-hmm.
As Deming puts it, a bad culture beats a good person every time. To change that is leadership and initiative. That's why, despite having all my background in science and business, I think the most important area to develop as an individual and as hopefully as a culture is these social and emotional skills of human interaction, because it's our behavior that's causing these things. And changing behavior on a wide scale, well, on a personal scale is personal leadership, on a wide scale is leadership. You can't manage cultural change. You need management, but you need leadership too. So even though anyone who wants to work on this stuff, like doing the exercises in those books, a week each, that's a fair amount of time, but it's very rewarding. It doesn't cost anything
Mm-hmm.
to do the exercises. I think that is some of the most important things anyone can do for the environment. And when I talk about Norman Borlaug, I'll talk about how focusing on tactics without strategies is historic. It's what he worked against once he realized what was going on. Anyway, let's stop there.
I look forward to that talk. I'm really excited for that talk. So thank you very much for this whole conversation. It's been a long one, but as always, it was a good one.
Cool.
Thank you very much.